Okay, so in this brief video, we're going to show how to upload new budgets for you to propose for the next fiscal year. So after you've logged into Martus, you go to Planner and then Worksheets. For budget mods, we go to Change Requests, but to propose a new budget, we will go to Worksheets. Once at the Worksheet screen, whatever you have access to is the information you'd see. It'll default to the year you've been working in, generally fiscal year 19. So your first step is going to be to change 19 to 20, and then click Filter so that the Martus system will update to the fiscal year 2020. Now we can see 2020 is listed next to each checkbook, or worksheet as Martus calls it. And now we'd be prepared to prepare a budget for fiscal year 2020. So in this example, we'll work on the Vice President's discretionary funds. So first I need to filter to the program so it's easier for me to find. Most users won't have to do that. And we'll find the checkbook we want to make a proposal to, and we will click Edit. Once we land on this page, the first thing we notice is that the year says 2020. Here's our checkbook, here's the program, and then here we see 2019 actual. This is the current fund activity, including revenue and expenses as they've occurred throughout the fiscal year. So we know when revenue came in, we know when expenses went out, and far at the end, the last column is the total budget. So we know for the year they've budgeted $3,000 in revenue and $4,500 in expenses. And that can be used to make a basis or judgment for what you want to budget for 2020. There's a couple of ways we can do this. Furthest, most simplistic way is to choose from account and funding source down below, similar to when we're adding a new account we haven't budgeted on a budget mod. So when I do that, we'll choose that propane account from the expense above, the funding source that their office uses. Once we have those two things selected, I can click Add Line. And now under the 2020 budget, that combination I've added has been added below that. There's no budgetary information yet. That's up to us to add. And this is one of those areas, if you're going to add your budget this way, make sure you select both an account and a funding source. Martus will not stop you from only selecting an account. If you don't select a funding source, it will accept that and include that as part of your budget. And that could cause some errors later on once we upload the budgets for the new fiscal year for you to spend with. So just make sure account and funding source is used before you click Add Line. Now that we've added the one account, if we know for the year, based on experience, we're looking up here, if we spent $3,000 so far through the year, if that's all we think we'll spend, we can simply click into the October 2019 field, choose the $3,000, and this also happens to be an account that receives revenue, so we do not want a gain or a loss to be represented here. We should have the same amount of revenue. So we have the donations field. So now we're going to add that. Repeat with the funding source. We'll add the line. Now we can see the breakout in the 2020 budget. Here's revenue, or income as it says in Martus. Here's expense. And if we believe the revenue will be $3,000 as it was in the prior year, we can copy that. And now we have a budget that has no gain or loss, meaning our revenue equals our expense. And when I click Save, that would be all that is needed for this specific budget to be submitted for fiscal year 2020. And then the 1, 3, 5 year plans could be set individually as instructed in Lynette's email to her attention. Now, for a lot of programs, this may not be feasible because we budget more line items than in this particular example. So I'm going to delete these two, and I'm going to walk you through a second way we can do this much more quickly. So you see I've checkmarked these boxes underneath the delete option. When I click delete, the budget disappears. We're back to not having a budget for 2020. So for those programs that don't want to take the time to enter each account number and funding source combination one by one, you can always come back up here to where it says load. So when I do that, it's going to repeat the same account numbers and funding sources that had activity in the current fiscal year, and it gets repeated for next fiscal year. What you want to do when you do that, number one, is you want to make sure that the funding source that's being assigned is the funding source you'll continue to use in 2020. Likely, if you have general funds, casino funds, indirect, and revenue funds, that's going to be the case. And for those who work on grants, you may want to check with your monitor to see if a new fund number is going to be assigned before you do it this way. If the new fund number is going to be assigned, you will have to add it one by one because that fund number didn't exist for activity in the current fiscal year. So now that we've copied or loaded the 2019 account numbers and funding sources, we can now add a budget. We can type right into these areas if we want to duplicate what was had there or come up with our own numbers. And depending on the number of funds and accounts that you have, that could be a pretty big task. So we can also copy our current budgets or our actual numbers depending on our preference. So after we've loaded, there's an option here that says Initialize Worksheet. So when I click that, a little box pops up. Wants to know, are we going to initialize all account values, income and expense? We could choose one or the other. Both are selected, so I'll leave both selected. The next thing it wants us to tell it is, do we want to use the actual numbers or the budget numbers? Be careful on which one you choose. If you choose actual numbers, we've only had activity occurring up through a certain period. So if you use the actual numbers, you may be missing 4 to 5 months of data, and you may end up under proposing your budget. So my recommendation would be to copy the current year budget. So all I did was click the top, use all current year budget numbers. If we're going to leave it exactly the same as it was in fiscal year 19, then we can adjust it by 100%. 100% of the current budget is the same. If we want to increase or decrease, we can do that by changing the 100%. So let's take a look at what 100% looks like when we leave it at that. We have 100%. I'll click Set Values. And now we can see it's entered the same budget that was existing in 2019. So 2019, donations had a budget of $3,000. And the propane line item had a budget of $4,500. Now when we look here, we now see those two numbers represented. If we're happy with what's being shown, then we can click Save Worksheet. My recommendation on doing these things is not to use the Submit Worksheet button. And when you click Submit, it locks the worksheet. You'll no longer be able to make an edit or change to your budget without first contacting Cecilia Fire Club, Ken Packard, or myself to unlock the budget. So for convenience purposes, easier just to save it. Now, I'm going to delete these budgets again. We're going to do this exercise one more time. So we will load, and that loads the account numbers and funding sources that had activity in the current year. We can see those there. And we're going to initialize the worksheet. We'll keep it at the income and expense levels. I still want to use the budget numbers. But in this case, maybe we're expecting a small growth of 5%. So I'm adding a 5 to the 100 number. Click Set Values. And now the donations line item says $3,150, which is 5% more than the $3,000 budgeted in fiscal year 19. The propane line says $4,725, which is 5% more than the $4,500 budget from fiscal year 19. If we were only going to increase this by 5%, we can see that there's a new line here, this fund balance carryover from prior activity. We don't expect to use that account. I'm going to clean that up by deleting that single line and clicking Save Worksheet. One problem we notice by doing this is this budget is not balanced. We can see the big red numbers here. There's a difference of $1,500 because expenses are exceeding the donations budget by that amount. This is an opportune time to make that correction for the fiscal year 20 budget. The program is going to have to make that correction for fiscal year 19 because that's where the problem's starting. So you're going to be very careful in what you're doing, because if you have a problem existing in your 19 budget and we do it through this load and initialize, you can end up pushing the problem to a second year. So be very careful in what you're doing. Make sure your fiscal year 19 budget is in order before you start this process. Make sure that any funding source that you need created for new grants or new contract years are done before we start working in Martus. If they don't exist, you can't assign any budget to them until they've been created first. And that process starts with your program monitor. If we wanted to see our budget, we're going to continue with this example even though it's incorrect. If we wanted to see the budget we saved, you can come to Worksheets, click on Edit and view this information, or we could go under the Planner option, go to Summary, and what it's going to land on is a default view. It's on Program View. I see more than one program, so we know that we've had multiple programs start preparing their budgets. And if we were the Vice President's office, this is the view they would see currently. That can be changed. There's this Program View here. We get other options. We can see just accounts, checkbooks, or funding sources. So let's look at what the funding source one looks like. I'm also going to change the columns. I don't want to see the months. There's 11 wasted spaces here. Maybe I want to see the budget analysis. Now let's take a view. By clicking Load, we see the 19 budget information are the first 4 columns, and then we see our proposed budget. So by looking here, we can see our $3,000 proposed budget for the discretionary income. Here's that $4,000 line item. Here's what it was last year. So we've increased it by $225 or by 5%. We know that there's currently no proposed budget for the general fund or their indirect funds. So this would be a clue that if we thought our work was done, are we still anticipating to be funded through those 2 separate sets of funds? If so, we have more budget we have to propose. And if we wanted to print this, this is our chance to print this page. We're also creating a separate report in Intact called Intact Budget Comparison that you can see. It will allow you to see your budgets, or for the few of you who attended the General Ledger class, you can go to General Ledger and then Budget Reports to view what you're proposing in 2020. So if you have any questions, take a look at this video, look at the handouts in the RST Learning Center. Thank you.